Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. My name's Eleanor Robson, and I'm a Research and Policy Officer at the Future Earth Australia Secretariat. The Future Earth Australia Secretariat is based at the Australian Academy of Science in Canberra, but I'm a one-woman outpost in Brisbane, up in Queensland. So just to kick off, of course, the first thing that I'd like to do is just acknowledge that I am coming to you from Yagara and Turrbal country. That always was and always will be Yagara and Turrbal country. And I'd just encourage you, if you get the chance, just to pop into the chat box where you're joining from, the traditional lands that you're joining from. I always find that it's a really cool kind of way to just get an idea of where people are in space, given that Zoom can be a bit discombobulating sometimes. So please do that. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this last session that we have today on empowering adaptation. Behind the scenes, we've kind of termed it the Getting It Done Day, which turns out it ends up being more of a process than a thing that we achieve, but for our own purposes, we're happy to call it that. This last session is going to really draw upon, I suppose, the contributions that have already been made, firstly by our keynote speaker, Marcelo Mena Carrasco, who is from Chile last evening, I believe, speaking from his experience, for our speakers in the first session, talking about, tackling risk and harnessing finance to make climate adaptation scale up in a really, I suppose, deep and broad way. The second session that we've just come out of around, who does what and how. And now coming to our session around what are the frameworks that we need to use to enable this success. So frameworks, it's not the first time that this has come up, obviously, over the day. It's hard to talk about enabling adaptation without speaking about the frameworks that we're going to use to make them happen in a way which is going to achieve the things that we want to, instead of this ad hoc, messy, clumsy process that will likely leave a lot of people behind, and, in a future that we don't quite want. So I think before I introduce our panelists, I would like to just read out something, I suppose the frame around adaptation that we've drawn from our federal government and some of their documents, just to give us something to be able to bounce off and react to in a way. So they frame adaptation as climate change adaptation helps individuals, communities, organisations and natural systems to deal with those consequences of climate change that cannot be avoided. It involves taking practical actions to manage risks from climate impacts, protect communities, and strengthen the resilience of the economy. Adaptation can involve gradual transformation with many small steps over time, or major transformation with rapid change. So as I mentioned, this is not the first time that this has come up over the course of today, or even yesterday when we were speaking about different knowledge approaches that we bring to the adaptation challenge. Speakers across sessions have been speaking about the importance of collaboration across sectors, knowledge types and communities, which, to date has continuously been a notoriously difficult nut to crack. Coordination and leadership, yet the maintenance of a certain level of decentralization and empowered decision-making in a granular level has also come up as important, whether it be from empowering communities or harnessing global capital. And of course, this last session that we've just heard from raised the fundamental questions for our frameworks and policy, which I know that our panelists will have a lot to say about, which is, when it comes to frameworks, it really is also a question about what are we prioritizing, given that we will lose things, and what does that say about who that's for? Who are we prioritizing? So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. I'm going to firstly introduce Ketan Joshi, who unfortunately is not able to join us in person today because he's in Oslo and the time zone is horrific, but he's kindly sent us a pre-recorded contribution, which I'll play in a moment. Ketan is a prolific data-driven science communicator, author and commentator with a focus on climate change, renewable energy and technological innovation. Ketan formerly worked as a communication specialist for CSIRO's Data 61 and as an analytics specialist for the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, also known as ARENA. I'm going to just share my screen now so that I can play this for you. Here we go. Could I please get confirmation that you can see my screen? I hope so. Lovely, thank you. Here we go.
Hi, everyone. It's really good to be here, even though I am not quite there. This is recorded the day before. What I'm going to be talking about today is the intersection between climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And I'm going to be talking about the real focus point for this at the moment, which is renewable energy and electricity grids all around the world. This is a really, really important issue, and oddly enough, it's not something that comes up. The struggle to decarbonize electricity grids around the world has really taken the focus, and nobody really wants to think too much about all the stuff that's going to be coming in the next few decades. So I want to talk a little bit about it because this is something that keeps coming up in my work, it keeps coming up in the news, and so it's something that we need to start thinking about a fair bit more. So what I want to start off with is the baseline. It's the things that we really need to be thinking about when it comes to electricity grids is emissions. This is why we're doing the entire thing in the first place. And there was a great report that came out from an organization called Climate Analytics a couple of months ago called the Scaling Up Australia report. And what this report does is it looks at what needs to be reduced across Australia's various sectors to hit a climate target of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And they split this out into many different sectors. I strongly recommend having a look at this report. It's very, very good. But on the left-hand side here, we've actually got a couple of charts that show what needs to happen in Australia. But what actually needs to happen is a much faster decline. That's the green line on that top chart. Emissions actually need to hit near zero in Australia's electricity grid by the year 2030. And the reason it needs to happen much faster is that as other sectors of Australia's grid, of Australia's economy electrify, those need to be added onto the electricity grid. So any residual emissions on the electricity grid will just be amplified as demand increases. And you can actually see that demand increase on the second chart there that shows that under a sort of best case scenario, that Australia's total electricity consumption increases 2 or 3 times over the next 3 decades. That's really, really significant increase in total electricity generation. So not only are we talking about changing the very fundamentals of the electricity grid, we're actually also talking about making it bigger, making this system, it's already the world's largest interconnected machine that we see in Australia's national electricity market, and it needs to become even bigger by 2 or 3 times to hit these climate goals. On the right-hand side is a piece of modelling that was done by the organisation that looks after the electricity grid. That's called the Australian Energy Market Operator. And they've done this scenario that they release every 2 years called an integrated system plan. And it basically looks at a bunch of different possibilities for the future of Australia's national electricity market. And they choose a really interesting mix of different scenarios here, ranging from very weak ambition in terms of reducing emissions to very high ambition. And it's not just an Australian government policy thing. They're actually plugging in all these variables from around the world in terms of the cost of renewables, the actual success of rolling them out in Australia, in addition to how fast we shut down fossil fuel power stations in Australia. The 3 scenarios that I've put on this chart are step, slow, and central. Central is, as you might imagine, it's in the middle. Slow is exactly what it sounds like. Step change is actually a phrase to describe a change that is going sort of from the middle and stepping right up to the top of the ambition level. So it's sort of the best case scenario. And as you can see there, even the grid operator's best case scenario that they're modeled is actually not quite the same as a zero emissions grid by 2030, which is what we would need to have to align with the 1.5 degrees target. So this is something that I find really significant, right? The rate of change that's needed in Australia's grid is about maybe 2/3 too slow in the most ambitious way we can imagine. That's not a good thing. So this is actually, there's a gap between what we're sort of talking about in Australia's grid and what needs to happen for Australia to be on a pathway to, first of all, net zero emissions by 2050, but also more importantly, achieving a carbon budget of 1.5 degrees Celsius. What the Australian Energy Market Operator, I'm going to refer to them as AEMO, what they did for this piece of modelling is they actually incorporated the risks of climate change into their models. So the electricity grid is interconnected with the climate system in a bunch of different ways. The most important in my mind, and the most important when it comes to modelling, is temperature. Temperature affects demand. It affects the amount of electricity consumed. Of course, you can see this in the day-to-day scale. During summer, the key driver of electricity demand in Australia's grid is air conditioning. And when it comes to extreme temperature events, what we're seeing is, of course, a greater and greater load from air conditioning as temperature increases. We're already seeing that in terms of massive amounts of demand, unprecedented amounts of demand, which is being offset to some degree by solar power, the growth of solar power on Australia's electricity grid. What we also see, of course, is that as temperature increases, it starts to muck with generation assets. In Australia, what we're also seeing is coal and gas-fired power stations, to a far greater degree, coal-fired power stations, having really, really major shutdowns and during very, very critical moments of grid stress. Of course, as temperature increases, demand increases. That's when you need to have the most reliable demand, but it's also when those coal-fired power stations are failing the most. There's a bunch of other factors there as well. So bushfires, of course, we've seen that with the really tragic Black Saturday bushfires in 2009. Many of those, much of the loss of life from that event was from a power line that sparked a bushfire. And of course, that causes blackouts too. Wind and cyclones, the 2016 blackout in South Australia, of course, was a catastrophic storm event that was quite unprecedented for that geography and that time of year. And the Climate Council released a report very soon after that, basically saying that an increase in the frequency of those events is aligned with what we expect from climate impacts. Hydropower plants have their inflow impacted as well. And of course, coastal inundation and a mixture of these different events all happening in simultaneity they're all posing major risks to generation, to the electricity grid, and to a bunch of other components as well. And I want to bring up an example just to sort of wrap this up because it really works quite nicely. The Australian Energy Market Operator commissioned the Brattle Group to look at what other parts of the world are doing when it comes to dealing with climate risks. And America is a great example of somewhere where that is just decentralized. There's no overarching body trying to look after how you integrate all of these risks into how you plan for the future grid. It's a really tricky process because you're changing the grid fundamentally at the same time as the climate itself is changing fundamentally. This is a problem in America, of course. What we see there is that there's plenty of hostility towards regulation, but of course in a state like Texas, where there's really no love for the overseer of a federal government, it's a major problem. And of course, 10 years ago in Texas, there was a major unprecedented climate event where essentially this massive cold snap passed through the state. And that resulted in major blackouts. And that has happened again, but to a far greater degree in recent months. And what happened is the gas infrastructure in Texas froze. And of course, the political component of this is really important too, because that was blamed on the failure of a collection of wind turbines. Texas has the largest installed capacity of wind It's about 11th in America in terms of the proportion of wind power, but it has the largest installed capacity by far. So it gets a lot of attention when it comes to renewables. And of course, this was blamed on America's renewable energy policy, the Green New Deal. So what we're seeing around the world is a series of climate events impacting electricity grids and making it far, far harder to mitigate and reduce the likelihood of those climate impacts in the future because of the politics of the energy transition, but also the technical challenges of the energy transition too. So I want to wrap it up there. This is a very quick talk, but I hope this is enlightening for you. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you. Bye.
Okay, great. I would thank Ketan, however, he's not here. So we'll move on to the next speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is Katie Eberle. Katie is an experienced policymaker with more than 10 years of experience working in climate change policy, both in Australia and in the Pacific. Katie is currently the Manager for International Climate Partnerships at the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. So I might ask Katie whether you could unmute yourself and turn your camera on. Great.
How am I doing?
Perfect.
Lovely. Thank you very much for the introduction, Eleanor, and for the invitation to attend today's event as well. As Eleanor mentioned, I'm the Manager of International Partnerships in the Department of Industry. I work inside the International Climate Change and Technology Strategy Division there. I'm living and working on unceded Ngunnawal country, and I would like to offer my respect and my gratitude to Ngunnawal people and leaders past, present and future who've cared for this very beautiful country on which I'm privileged to live. I am participating in today's event with a slight degree of imposter syndrome. I haven't worked directly on climate adaptation policy for some years now, and most of you listening in today will have a sharper sense of the latest thinking on adaptation than I do. However, some years previously, I was Director of the Adaptation and Climate Science Policy team in the Department of the Environment and Energy. As a member of that team, I helped to deliver the first National Climate Resilience and Adaptation Strategy, which was presented in the lead up to the 2015 Conference of Parties in Paris, where the Paris Agreement was made. Some other important things that that team worked on were the delivery with CSIRO of Climate Compass. Climate Compass is the risk management framework that's now being used inside the Australian public sector at the national level to manage risks from climate change to policies, programs and asset management. And we also worked really closely with the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility, which we call NCARF, to deliver Coast Adapt, which is an information delivery and decision support framework that looks at the risks Australia's coast and coastal communities face from climate change and sea level rise. And it considers the ways that we can respond to those risks across multiple sectors, whether it's from urban planning and infrastructure all the way through to dealing with legal risk. So there's some examples of some of the things that I worked on in my time in adaptation. Since then, I've held a variety of more mitigation focused roles in international climate change policy. So our current home is not within the Department of Environment anymore, it's in the Department of Industry. And from there, I was posted to Papua New Guinea in 2018, where I was embedded in the PNG Climate Change and Development Authority, where we provided policy advice and some support. And I returned to Australia last year, and since then I've been working on a number of international programs supported by the Australian government and focused on the Indo-Pacific. So these programs that we work on provide support to our partners in the region who are building their greenhouse gas inventories and developing their ability to measure, report on and protect important ecosystems that sequester carbon, including forests, mangroves and seagrasses. So I thought what might be useful today was to reflect briefly on what I learned from my time working in adaptation that has a bearing on other areas of climate change policy, which illuminate my thinking on mitigation, development and climate change finance. I think we're used to thinking about how mitigation can support adaptation. I thought I would reverse that a little bit. and think about how the frameworks that are often used in adaptation thinking and practice have a broader application. I'm thinking specifically of the iterative risk framework, risk management frameworks that we often use, or as an alternative, the VKR framework that the CSIRO often uses, VKR standing for the values, rules and knowledge that influence and define decision contexts. These frameworks and other adaptation heuristics or rules of thumb are probably very familiar to this audience. And as adaptation has been firmly established as an academic discipline, as a practice, and as it gains a policy foothold, these skills and approaches that we've acquired and adopted have insights contained within them that I think could be better integrated into our broader thinking about international engagement, climate change mitigation, and climate finance. I'm going to give a couple of examples today, but no doubt you'll be able to identify others from your own experience. I thought I would start with our work with NCAF on Coast Adapt, which was highly user needs focused. It leveraged some earlier investments in NCAF to strengthen the community of adaptation practice, of which you are likely all members, and it highly valued action and knowledge at the local level and the views of its end users. As we worked in adaptation with NCAF, with the CSIRO and with local government practitioners, we learned that we need to ground truth everything at the local level, from geospatial data through to our assumptions about community values, what they actually are, what they really are. We needed to ground truth these assumptions with local communities themselves and to really consider a diverse range of voices within those communities. While local, like national coherence and strategy is important to adaptation, adaptation needs planning and implementation are often really dictated by processes at the local level. It's very tempting when we think about mitigation policies at the national level to focus on the broadest of economic levers, without really taking time to consider the impacts on local environments, social structures, and the cultural needs and expectations at that local level. Adaptation and climate change science practitioners in Australia and in our broader region are making really genuine attempts to recognise First Nations and Indigenous expertise in particular, and to include local communities in planning and decision making. But mitigation policy often remains less willing to listen to those diverse voices and is sometimes more focused on realpolitik and private sector stakeholders. Similarly, from CSIRO's past work on planning for climate change and natural resource management, I learned about the importance of taking time, spending a significant amount of time to really develop knowledge brokers who can effectively communicate the complexities of things like climate change projections with local decision makers and sectoral decision makers. This communication process absolutely has to be two-way. So we've been using this insight to improve the blue carbon programs we are running in Indonesia and in other Pacific countries. And in addition to the technical guidance we're developing on incorporating blue carbon into greenhouse gas inventories and meeting the reporting requirements of the UNFCCC, we're also working with the Coral Triangle Centre in Indonesia to develop training for policymakers, like non-technical policymakers across the region on blue carbon, that thinks about adaptation, mitigation and community livelihoods in a holistic way. And really trying to build their capacity, these policymakers' capacity as knowledge brokers to enhance the success of the program. So I mentioned earlier that adaptation is often driven by local conditions, but it also influences or is influenced by adaptation actions at other scales. Climate change risk, as we know from adaptation, can travel across scales, spread across systems like the financial system and between jurisdictions. And maladaptation can mean the transfer of impacts to those least able to shoulder the burden. And I think some of these concepts can and should apply to thinking about mitigation policies. The risk of maladaptation points to the need to help our partner countries systematically assess climate risks and vulnerabilities and to include adaptation measures in their wider development policies, plans and projects. What often can seem like a challenge or a limitation to adaptation practitioners, the lack of a single simple measurable like the cost of abatement, has forced adaptation practitioners to consider system-wide implications for their interventions, to consider the environment, the social needs and the economy as mutually dependent and connected. And I think these should be increasingly considered for mitigation interventions as well, rather than just looking at that single data set on cost of abatement. The example that I give of that is carbon offset projects, which aim to sequester carbon and reduce emissions, but they are increasingly being asked to consider and price in the value of non-carbon benefits, the social livelihoods or biodiversity benefits. Adaptation policymakers and practitioners have no choice but to think in long-term and systemic ways. At a national level, this gradually translated into whole of government processes and capacity building through Climate Compass, and a greater degree of policy coherence through the work of the Australian Government's Disaster and Climate Resilience Reference Group. And this whole of government approach in the adaptation and resilience space has only very recently been extended to other areas of climate policy, and we need to do further work in this space. So I note that there's recently been a position of climate coordinator established within Prime Minister and Cabinet, and there's now a concerted effort by government to integrate climate change considerations across our aid program as well. So I think these are really important positive signs. I'm really hopeful that the trade-offs and synergies between adaptation and mitigation are now starting to be better recognised, especially in the land sector, where adaptation options for climate change can have really positive impacts on mitigation. And I think that I hope we'll continue to optimise that link between adaptation and mitigation activities in my own work in the international partnership space. I will continue to prioritise mitigation activities that help to reduce pressure on natural resources and ecosystems, including vulnerability to climate change as a risk that needs to be analysed in mitigation activities. And we'll continue to choose those activities that enhance local adaptive capacity and promote sustainable livelihoods for local populations. We're going to continue to look for the best entry points for integrating adaptation to climate variability and climate change into those international programs, and use mitigation finance to help bolster the business case for investment into adaptation. And we'll continue to explore possibilities for synergies between adaptation and mitigation in sectors like energy, agriculture and forestry. So I might leave it there and hand back to Eleanor, and I look forward to joining the other speakers in the panel discussion.
Awesome. Thank you, Katie. That was fantastic, very comprehensive, and brought up a lot of interesting points that we've heard from other people as well around, you know, adaptive capacity and iteratively kind of building in these things as a process as opposed to a finish point. I would like now to introduce the lovely Kate Auty as our next speaker. Kate is a specialist in environmental and social justice reporting, particularly on cities and sustainability, climate change, Aboriginal justice issues, women, leadership, and the environment. Kate was the ACT Commissioner for Sustainability and the Environment between 2016 and 2020. I don't know why that put me in a tailspin. And was the Victorian Commissioner for Environmental Sustainability from 2010 until 2014. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, Eleanor. Thanks very much for inviting me to be part of this panel and the presentation. I'm coming to the meeting from Taungurung country, and in typing that in, I made a note that it is in northeast Victoria, notwithstanding that Victoria is, of course, what we call it because of our colonial past. But in relation to Taungurung people and Taungurung's contribution to my understanding of country, I just want to acknowledge Taungurung women in particular and Yorta Yorta women. And I also want to acknowledge all the emerging leaders that I've recently had a lot to do with, because they, of course, are thinking through some of these issues in a way that is really educative for all of us. So just noting all of that, the Taungurung are critical to our understanding in this part of the world, and in particular in Euroa. Now, I'm going to talk about a number of things that come from what I would describe as probably much more grainy, gritty or dirty fingernails type stuff than your previous speaker. And I think that's the beauty of this panel. We come from a range of backgrounds and we bring a range of understandings to this conversation. I'm part of a community energy group here in Euroa, where we have a Euroa microgrid demonstration initiative, which we've been working through delivering to business and the community. And I'm also part of a group that is now working on a green precinct opportunity here in town, if we can just get the Australian Rail Track Corporation to agree with us about the benefits of that. So you get a bit of an impression that I come from a grassroots community background, as well as having that other experience that Eleanor just spoke of. But what I'd like to talk about here today is about how mitigation and adaptation, of course, are twinned. And I'd like to talk in particular about the just transition we need to see, where we leave no one behind. And we've thought about just transitions, I think, in recent times as quite essentially linked to mitigation, but I think that we need to be contemplating how it actually is absolutely ingrained in adaptation. And I want to specifically just go to an example that I think assists us to understand that, which is what's happened here in recent times in Victoria, which was the Latrobe Valley Authority. It was created to deal with the fact that Hazelwood had closed. There was nothing that could be done about that. Private enterprise viewed the ongoing running of that particular power station as unviable and closed rather presumptively. What occurred as a result of that is that the Victorian government created a thing called the Latrobe Valley Authority. And in December 2019, they put together a community report. That community report is a document that's very easy to read, it's very accessible, and it speaks to the experience of people in the Latrobe Valley as that power station closed. And I'm going to read some statistics because they, of course, assist people, and I know there's some early career researchers involved in this panel and in this particular presentation, and you might find that report instructive from the point of view of reporting as you see the need to do it out of your careers or in developing your careers. There was a lot of concern about worker transition in the Latrobe Valley as that station closed, and it was the case that everybody thought that the Latrobe Valley would be a basket case as a result of it. It already had a number of issues. It had issues about air quality and other challenges. But what really happened down there was the framework that they put together to inspire change and to deal with that peremptory way of closing that station meant that people did, in fact, benefit. Not everybody benefited. Not everybody got the job they wanted. Not everybody kept doing what they wanted. But fascinatingly, 74% of all of the people who were in the Latrobe Valley who were exposed to what was happening, not just with the power station, but also with some forestry changes, continued to be employed, or they were not looking for work. And that figure was staggering in that it was better than the figure that they were, in fact, reflecting on coming out of the closure. And I'm just going to run through some of these statistics because I think they're useful and instructive. 1,400 workers and families were in fact assisted with what might be described as family support and counselling. We will need to think about that as we get into the transition space and as we deal with the closures that we know we're going to have to contend with. 2,000 qualifications were obtained by people who went back into training, and that training was at many levels through TAFE and through others. There were many negotiated agreements with government, the power stations and trade unions, and what's fascinating about this particular exercise is that trade unions and government came together to work with business, and that we see the outcomes of that happening. So any framework we want to see that deals with adaptation, mitigation and the human challenges that this is all going to mean is going to have to be a collaborative enterprise. There were 140 business reimbursements of fees and charges, and that involved some sharing of the onerousness of that between local government and state government. So each of them, of course, had expenses or charges and fees, and each of them took a view that there were some ways in which they could alleviate the pressure on people who might want to continue to run a business, who might want to establish a business, who might have expenses that they would have thought they could pay for out of a salary that they no longer had. There were also a number of workshops. There were 700 businesses in that particular part of Victoria who were provided with profile and marketing support. There were Jobs First programs, which involves government in deciding that there would be a process of employing people locally. And those local jobs were not trivial. They involved putting together some of the major infrastructure in places like the Avon River Bridge, in respect of the Gippsland Aquatic Centre and the Latrobe Valley Government Hub. hub. So there were construction and infrastructure jobs, but they were jobs that went to people in the region first. Again, a partnership between the private providers and the governments about what was the government about what was necessary. There was also a partnership between Regional Development Victoria and the government, and projects which were put forward were funded. There was something like about $94.4 million churned into the particular economy down there because of the way regional development and the state government worked together. They say that in December 2019, there were 968 jobs actually created coming out of the closure of that power station. There was also associated with those jobs business opportunities, government opportunities, education opportunities, and people starting themselves up in the way they might think of an enterprise that they hadn't even contemplated previously. It was critical to think about the ways in which the supply chain transition was to be impacted and affected. And it was also important to think about the ways in which you might set up new businesses that involved energy and energy transitions. In fact, down there, the SEA Electric is an electric vehicle assembly plant, and at that time there were 500 jobs created in that plant through TAFE, Gippsland and the government, and through the way in which they shared that responsibility, and they're producing 2,400 vehicles a year. It's really clear that if you're thinking about a framework that's going to address the climate change transition that we know we are in for, and that we want to see a just transition in relation to that, we're going to have to be involved in social and economic and environmental undertakings. In terms of social undertakings, they brought on board the people who were producing community projects down there from the non-government sector. 186 community projects involved people, $20 million was spent on that, and there were 50 local events up until that time that involved the Gippsland community. The Victorian government also took the view that they would be trying to reduce people's energy costs in that region, and as a result of that, home energy upgrades were undertaken, and there were 810 assessments at that time, 717 upgrades, and 42 were in progress in December at that when they compiled that report. It's the case that there was a good deal of interest in what might happen with international students. I'm pretty sure that COVID's probably cruelled some of that, but there has been a lot of interest in what's been done with youth and how youth is going to have a future in Gippsland. So social, economic and environmental achievements as a result of saying that the framework would address all of those matters. If I take that as an example of what we can all do across this state or across the country, it's pretty clear to me that the things that we're doing here in our microcosm with the Euroa microgrid is a good example of that. It's not just toying with these ideas. We are at the end of the grid. Previously, we were regarded as a basket case because of that very issue. We're now regarded as the potential prosumers of our own energy as a result of how everything has changed. Nothing is the same. And as a result of what we've done here as a tiny little community with government funding and with the use and assistance of energy providers who are thinking about community energy, we now have a microgrid that has the potential to be delivering to what we know to be our brownouts and to a number of businesses in this town, which range from bakeries to the timber works. The other thing that's come out of all of this for me and for other communities, and I think we shouldn't underestimate this, is understanding our capacity to organise. Here in Euroa, our theory of change is very simple. It's start where you are, it's organise, and it's then show what you did, because showing people what we do is critical. Demonstration sites illustrate what can be done, but organising is absolutely the most conscious thing we're doing at the moment about a number of our projects here, and one of them is this green precinct. We've realised that we have extraordinary links right up and down the northeast. We've realised that there's ways in which we can deploy the political operatives that are part of our community at the local government level and more broadly, and into what we know to be our federal electorate of Indi with Helen Haynes. As a result of our thinking through of our role, we've contributed to Helen Haynes' local power plan, which has just been picked up by the National Farmers Federation and embraced. So out of all of this, it's my view that the frameworks that we think about will involve all tiers of government, and we would hope that that would go up to the federal government and go down to local government, but it will also involve all of us in the social enterprises, the energy enterprises, the environment enterprises that we're all going to be wanting to see come to fruition. Out of all of this, I suppose we have recently had Victorian council elections, and we worked very hard to make sure that our local government is more representative of our views. And our council this very day is considering the climate emergency declaration. So I suppose what I would say is things change. They never stay the same, no matter how much we feel oppressed by how that might appear to be the case. But frameworks have to be collaborative, participatory, understand that there is a social, economic and environmental player, and that we're all part of that. Organising is critical. We need to get better at it, and we need to assist our communities to do it. So that's it from me, Eleanor. I hope that's helpful about frameworks for adaptation crossing all of the boundaries.
Fabulous. Thank you, Kate. A lovely compliment between you and Kate and Katie, with the very different, the kind of Katie's kind of higher level international, national perspective, and yours from your experience living at home in Euroa and your previous experience. So thank you. That's great. Now, we've had a bit of a spanner thrown in the works on the back end, unfortunately. Dorean Erhart, who is our next speaker, unfortunately has had her computer conk out on her midway through the panel, unfortunately. So I'm going to just read a little bit about her and urge you to find her, a bit of her work if you'd like to follow up on that. So Dorean is a climate change specialist who spent a lot of time at the Local Government Association of Queensland, supporting and activating subnational governments to act on emissions reduction, but also to deal with their mitigating their climate risk. So Dorean developed and managed the award-winning Queensland Climate Resilient Councils program, and has now recently, in the past week or two, moved over to begin her consultancy, Linden Climate. So I'd urge you to go and find her on all of the internet sites that you could possibly find. But in the meantime, it's also my pleasure to ask our fearless leader, Dr. Tiana O'Donnell, who in her own right is an expert in adaptation, particularly around the legal and geographical aspects of coastal adaptation, to speak briefly on her experience and her reflections on frameworks for adaptation before we move into some questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor, for that very gracious introduction, and thank you, fellow panelists, for your thoughts to date. It is with a heavy heart that Dorean cannot join us, and I say that because her work, particularly with coastal, but also all local governments across Queensland, around embedding climate change, adaptation and climate risk thinking into everyday decision making for local government really is groundbreaking, and she has some great insights there. So I do encourage you to reach out to her. In having a think about what thoughts I could possibly offer you with about 30 seconds notice, I've settled on the need to really reinforce how important leadership is, and leadership cuts across all scales, geographical and temporal, spatial scales. And in settling on that, I'm reflecting on the decision in 2017, I believe it was, or perhaps 2018, of the federal government to withdraw funding for the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility. And at that time, it came as, it wasn't all that unsurprising, but it still came as a shock to the very broad community of adaptation researchers and practitioners that network, under the leadership of Professor Jean Polutikoff, had fostered. And we're talking about many thousands of people who were directly impacted by the withdrawal of NCARF as the central anchor and coordinator of adaptation thinking, research and action. And in the days or hours and days that followed the formal announcement in the federal budget, we didn't really hear from anyone around the critical thinking of why that decision was made, who was now going to be the voice for adaptation, what it now meant for Australia and Australians to have this void in adaptation thinking and practice. And so a colleague of mine, Jo Mummery, and myself, we wrote a piece for The Conversation outlining this and pointing to the things that many of us, whether we're adaptation practitioners or not, already know, which is that disasters cost a lot of money. National leadership is critical. We cannot, or we should not, be a society that is reactive and responding after an event. We should be as proactive as we possibly can be. And indeed, in being proactive and trying to anticipate impacts and build in resilience and adaptive capacity, it will in fact cost far, far less, as we've heard from a number of speakers today. It will cost far, far less to do that rather than to sit back and wait for the disaster to happen and hope that the insurance sector will step in. And we know that insurers and reinsurers are increasingly pricing out risk in the Australian market, and that really leaves governments as the insurer of last resort. So the leadership of all of those sectors is critical, but it's also incumbent upon us as individuals to find our voice and to be willing to speak up about what we want to fight for, what is valuable for our future generations, and indeed even ourselves, because we're already living in a climate impacted world. So I'm going to leave it there and come back to you, Eleanor, if that's okay, and perhaps we can open up for a Q&A. Thank you for the opportunity.
Lovely, thank you, Tayana. I might ask for Katie and Kate, please, and Tayana, please, to put your video back on, and we can start having a go at some of these questions. So I've been kind of thinking around. I wanted to actually start with one of the questions that we've got in the Q&A, because I can see that Katie and Kate have been starting to put some answers in the text box, but I think there's actually a few questions that I'd like to just have a verbal discussion on as well. So we've got one which I think is just fabulous, which was, I believe, initially submitted by Taryn, and we can see here that she's saying, you know, in recent times, there's been a growing chorus and support for female leadership, and women now really coming out in front to drive the changes we need across society. And I suppose this speaks also to Tayana's point about leadership. What are the new avenues for leadership, and how can women inspire change? And I just quickly want to tie this to another question that I had personally, which may or may not link to, you know, the female leadership aspect, but reflecting on Kate's comments around, Kate and Katie's comments around, you know, there are so many capabilities that we need to enable adaptation, which are not just strictly around policy instruments and hard numbers and those kinds of things like building partnerships, building capacity, engaging community, and all these other capabilities. So to tie those together, I suppose if we're thinking about leadership and perhaps some of those skills and capacities that may not always get factored in as a budget line item within building a framework, what are those capabilities that we need to be mindful of, and what, you know, if we're thinking about the composition of leadership, you know, I have my own views on this that I won't go into, but whether there might be some kind of things, some lessons to be drawn out there. Whoever would like to go, please jump in.
Eleanor, I might have a crack if you don't mind, because one of these issues is very close to my own heart, and it's the question of building a capacity and cultural competence. So it's really important for me as a white woman working at federal, at national level in policy, to recognise my own privilege and to recognise that I can't speak for all women. And I'm on a challenging journey of trying to understand where the limits of expertise that's practiced as currently in policy as a white person today are, and to understand how to create space for more diverse voices, and particularly the voices of Indigenous and First Nations women. I think that this is a really, really important capacity that we need to cultivate and consider and try and make space for at the national level, but in all areas of adaptation as well. So I thought I'd just throw that out there for discussion.
Thanks, Katie. I think here we are talking about climate change. Let me use a metaphor. I think we all need to be icebreakers. And I recently witnessed how empowering that could be when we were in Wangaratta for the Break the Silence, March to Break the Silence. And there were a number of young women in the audience or in the group there at Kings Park, and I was one of the speakers. And I walked around the audience and said to these young women, when it comes my turn to speak, I just want you to come up the front and I want you to come on the podium with me. I just want you to do it. And I didn't know that they would, because essentially you don't know whether you've broken the ice by just saying you could. What happened when I started to talk is I looked out at all of them. There were about 25 of them had come to the front of the crowd. And when I invited them to the stage, every one of them stepped up with their placards. And some of them, when I handed them the microphone, had something to say as well, but some did not. So that speaks to your point, Katie, that not everybody does want to speak, but I think our role is to be an icebreaker. And when we do it, we empower people. And I don't know whether any of you have ever had this experience, but I certainly have, going into courts where you've got a judge and, you know, I've been bullied by experts, I'm fond of saying, when I was a barrister, and feeling like you didn't really have the capacity to say what needed to be said. And if somebody makes it possible for you, then it suddenly becomes a watershed rather than a disaster. So icebreaking is what I would use as my metaphor, Eleanor, and I think we can all do it. And I think we all do it in various ways, and we do it whether we're my age or Katie's age or your age. And sometimes when we do it, the results are mind-blowing.
Yeah, I'd agree with all that. And Kate, you've always been and Katie, you as well, have been an inspiring mentor and leader for me personally, and I know for many, many women and others across the country. And it's a critical point to think about when to use your voice and how. And the example I gave earlier about the conversation piece, it really came about because we were so shocked that people who were in positions of privilege, senior professors or others who could have easily written that piece, weren't. They just sat back, and I don't know what happened, whether they were accepting the politics or didn't want to, you know, be critical of government or whatever it was that happened, but no one said anything. And we were just really shocked. But we also had the immense privilege of being able to say something, and indeed even having an audience with the conversation to do it. So there's a lot of levers and variables around how we would find our voice and how we would lead. And I really love that, the metaphor that you've given, Kate, around the community coming together to bolster everybody to lead in the ways that they want to. Yeah.
One of the other things I think we need to encourage people to understand is that no question is stupid. I think a lot of people are timid to ask or interrogate what they hear. And Tayana, your example of that conversation piece is a classic example of that. You could have been quiet and not done anything, and you might have done it for various reasons. But I think a lot of people are frightened, or not frightened, that's not the right word, but don't feel confident to ask the question because they worry that it might be regarded as dumb. And it's been my experience that that's not the case. And the reason that that's something I know is because when Aboriginal people have interrogated things that I've done over the years, they haven't always asked a direct question, but by the time we get to the answer, it's very clear that we all knew where we were going because of that conversation. And if I use an example out of a different part of my life at the Koori Court, when we were doing sentencing in Shepparton, I referred to that as a sentencing conversation. And I know some judicial officers really struggled with that, but it really opened up the floor to people who did have something to contribute. And I think we have to encourage people to understand that their contribution is valuable, even though sometimes we might think that's a pretty stupid question.
Great, thank you guys. So I have a few questions here. So one from Mark, who was reflecting on one of the panels that we had yesterday, saying George from the Hunter Valley yesterday emphasised the importance of long-term, i.e. decadal, investment into regional transition. Do you see that the investment into the Latrobe Valley, for example, will be maintained for long enough, and how long is this? And I'd like to add on, as someone who is a self-professed non-expert in adaptation. If this is a process, does that have to be maintained indefinitely? And when do you move to something else? What's that process look like?
Yeah, thanks. I'll take that as a question directed to me from Mark. Mark, when I first talked about this, it was in fact in Canberra, and there was some discussion that the authority was going to cease. The authority has continued, and I'm told that it will continue. I think it is important for there to be continuity, and I think it needs to be supported by regulatory regimes wherever that's possible, or by best practice or practice generally. And when you do have that ongoing support, obviously you have greater confidence in the outcomes. But I also think, on the other hand, when people acquire these skills, they don't always need the continuing support that we might have thought we needed to put in at the beginning. And sometimes we become much more self-reliant than we thought we might through these sorts of programs. So it's going to depend. It's absolutely critical that governments demonstrate their support for acting on climate change. There's just no doubt about that. That has to happen. And we are emboldened when we see it happening. But whether we need to continue to fund the same programs over time, whether those programs shift and morph into something else, that's probably something that is an ongoing discussion between government and community. And I think when we acquire the skills, we become more self-reliant, and that's actually quite a good thing. We've become very self-reliant in Victoria around community energy, for instance, but we've always had, in the recent times at least, good government support by way of funding. If that funding wasn't there, we would be screwed, but we have learnt skills. We know that we have been enabled, and whether we need it to continue in the same way is a question.
Great, thanks, Kate. Katie, you've had a lot of experience in managing programs all over the place. So what's your view on this as someone who does this?
I think that, it's a great question, and I think it's very timely. I think this is something that's being debated at the highest levels of politics in Australia today, this week, as we speak. I think that, to me, the critical question in terms of a just transition for regions that are increasingly going to see the traditional sources of their economic wealth and support eroded as fossil fuels are increasingly unviable. As Australia grows the industries of the future, for example, green hydrogen, there is no guarantee that those industries are going to be located in the same places that old industries are disappearing. So I think the real role of governments at the national and the state level is to really do the work to understand where those impacts are going to be felt. I think Australia's got a long history of providing regional support, so I don't doubt that that'll take place. I think that one of the ways that we can consider some of those issues is through our work on a long-term strategy for trying to achieve net zero as soon as possible, before 2050 if we can, and to meet our national targets. So the long-term strategy is one way of doing that. The intergenerational report is another way of considering that at the national policy level, and through our regular support for the regions, I think that's a third way. But to really look at what new industries are arising and where they might be located, and to think in those geographical terms, I think that's a useful thing to do.
And Katie, there was some very interesting press just this week coming out of Townsville, which you probably know about. But Townsville, of course, have been very supportive of Adani and very, very critical of people who were not in support of Adani in recent times, as we all know. And what's happened is the mayor was supportive of Adani, and the mayor has since come out and said that Adani is not the future, and that lithium and using their port for export of rare minerals or whatever else may well be the future. It would still be mining, but it's not the mining that they thought it would be. And that particular turnaround in that part of the world has come as a bit of a surprise to people from outside, but probably not at all a surprise to people who live there, because they've always been a bit entrepreneurial. They've always understood that they're a port city, or that they've got to be thinking about themselves as part of a global economy. And Adani convinced some people for some time that that was the case, but it's no longer how people are, how most people or many people are thinking about it, particularly local government. And I think that shift is extraordinarily interesting.
Yes, I agree. It was a very interesting report. I read it too. It made me think of the community of Port Kembla, who I think took a very similarly proactive stance about where they saw their future and what they wanted to do as a community about that. So I do think that there ought to be government support for that just transition, but at the same time, decisions need to be taken by communities about what kind of future they want as well.
Yeah. And I think too, going to the changes that we're seeing, Eleanor, COVID has made a lot of difference to a lot of people. I'm sitting in Euroa. I've been conducting board meetings from here for the last 12 months, and we are now so much more able in respect of how we think about ourselves as a dispersed workforce. And that, I think, is going to be interesting. It's no longer just the crude fly in, fly out that I witnessed in WA when I was over there as a magistrate, but it's more subtle, it's more sophisticated, and we've demonstrated we can do it. So there's a lot of changes that are aligning, and maybe the pandemic is one of the things that's going to give us, in a funny sort of way, a refresher about how good we can be when we are in a transition and it's not of our making.
Good one. Thank you. Okay, so there are two questions that are completely different, but I want to ask them together because I don't want to run out of time. Firstly, one from Superior, which is any must-reads recommendations around different frameworks. If anyone in the audience as well, I'm not sure if you have the capability, but the panelists, of course, and the attendees, please do feel free to put all recommendations in there to have a little look. And the last question for the panel is from Bob Webb. So you gave really interesting and totally complementary bottom-up and top-down perspectives, but how do we make those meet? That old chestnut. What would be the most useful federal frameworks or initiatives that would be most useful for local use? For example, how can the local best inform the national programs?
Oh, Bob.
5 minutes to solve that one.
Katie, do you want to answer the frameworks question and then we might go to Bob's? Is that okay?
I don't know that I can find an answer to, in a single document to pick up on those frameworks, but I will just refer back to the moment that I really started thinking about the frameworks for thinking about adaptation differently, and that was listening to Deborah Roberts' talk at one of the adaptation conferences, where she just said, if you come from South Africa, a risk framework means nothing. And I think that was the moment where I really started to explore what adaptation frameworks look like in different parts of the world, and that an iterative risk management framework wasn't always going to work. So I suggest, if you're going to look for those frameworks, start as far from home as you possibly can and challenge some of your assumptions, and look at some of the work on environment, climate adaptation and development. That would be my suggestion, but I'll let Kate tackle Bob's tricky question.
I love the fact that you said challenge assumptions, Katie, because I think that actually feeds into Bob's question. We assume that because there are these tiers of government that they don't link, and we've all worked in silos, and we all know that we've written reports for various governments that don't have a life where we really want them to be viable, which is at another level of government. So Bob, I hear what you say, and it is the tricky part of getting things done. Can I say that from my experience, I think we just have to be wise enough to know that this is done by doing it, and smart enough to use our networks to make sure that when we do it, we link everybody that we can to it. And we will be linking people who scratch their heads and say, what on earth has she rung me for? But the serendipitous nature of some of those links and connections is often what gives them a real viability, because it creates a frisson that we otherwise wouldn't have had. So that's a fairy tale way of thinking about it. But from our perspective, if I just take a ground up view, we have taken on board making sure that we educate our new local councillors to understand what we think they need to know about the science, for instance. We have taken on board linking them to people who we think they need to know about. And we are getting back from our new local councils thank yous for doing that. So I think we have to see ourselves as a bit of a conduit. And if we have those skills and ability, then we need to be exploiting them at every opportunity. And I must say that it always surprises me because people think that because I do that, that I have more links than they do. I don't know that that's the case. I just know that I exploit them more effectively or more efficiently or more routinely than probably some of my colleagues. And when you demonstrate that that's what happens, you suddenly find that people are emboldened. If I just give you a simple example from this afternoon, we're talking about this Australian Rail Track Corporation question. Glenrowan's just up the road from us. It's going to have this massive bridge built through the Siege site. It is a national heritage site. It's going to be a travesty. And the heritage officer rang me and I said, well, who are you talking to? She said, well, I don't know. I rang Barry Jones and said, Barry, can you talk to the heritage officer? You've got links in relation to this. And suddenly we've got a conversation happening that we couldn't have envisaged, 20 minutes ago. Now, I don't think I'm the only person with those sorts of connections. I think we all have them, and I think we should all be exploring how we make that conversation happen. Conversations do not change the world necessarily, Bob, but Margaret Mead's famous for saying that it's only ever been the case that a small group of people change the way we do things. So maybe conversations are powerful.
So inspiring. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now I'm just going to interject at this moment to ask Tayana whether you could please give us your thoughts on that question, given your experience, and also to take that opportunity to do a wrap of the whole day. Thank you. Thank
you, Eleanor. It's very difficult, I think, to follow that, Kate. You're so eloquent, and I have to confess in this live audience that I just adore you and appreciate everything that you do. And without everyone doing their part to lead and contribute to the conversation in whatever way we can, then we won't see action and we won't see the just transitions that we know need to happen as we adapt to a changing climate. So I think those are my thoughts for the end of this panel session, and thank you, fellow panelists, for your contributions. In terms of wrapping up the entire day for day 2 of the summit, it's been a powerful and informative day, and we've had a range of speakers from here in Australia and indeed around the world speaking with us on the broad topic of enabling action for adaptation. We had a wonderful keynote from Marcelo, based in Chile. So he joined us late in the evening, and his provocation really was, do we want to have the red pill or the green pill as we imagine our resilient and adaptive futures? Marcelo gave us a number of jumping off points to consider, the trade-offs that will need to be thought through, as well as how we embed social infrastructure and reducing inequality as we transition towards a low carbon or zero carbon future, and embed the adaptation that is needed to the already locked in changes from climate change. We then moved to our first panel of the day, where we had 4 speakers with expertise in climate finance and risk, talking with the audience about how we can think about climate change risk, how quickly that landscape has shifted in relation to the TCFD and other frameworks that are embedding disclosure of climate risk amongst private sector and others. And we then had quite a protracted and detailed discussion around the gaps and opportunities in thinking through frameworks for adaptation finance, where that money comes from, public, private, and perhaps a mixture of both, how it's spent, who evaluates that spend and makes sure that adaptation is indeed occurring with that expenditure, and we're not falling into maladaptive cycles. And most critically, I felt there was this recognition that we can't quantify or compensate for everything that's of value to us. And indeed, there are a number of cultural and other values that we have as social beings that cannot be compensated you know, with damages or with finance. There are things that are irreplaceable, and those are the things that we perhaps do not want to lose in the trade-offs that need to happen. We then moved to session 2, where we heard from a range of different speakers on the provocation, who is doing what and how. And it was a really powerful session in that we, as a panel, explored economic, social, structural pathways, what's working and what's not, and who's doing it, what needs to change, and indeed really unpacked this idea of trade-offs and vulnerability. And I really loved Mark Crosweller said towards the end, precariousness to the vulnerability of climate impacts affect all of us. So climate adaptation is relational. We are all going to be vulnerable, and we can't negate that vulnerability. So we really need to be explicit in accepting it and working together as a global, national, regional, local community and across all of those scales to reduce those impacts as much as we can. And of course, finally, we've had this panel where we've heard that energy targets must be ambitious. They must be well supported by government frameworks and other things. We have to optimise the links between mitigation and adaptation, recognising ground truthing and local level adaptation and a variety of knowledge perspectives is critical, as Katie mentioned. And we heard that adaptation must be a collaborative exercise, and that we must all use whatever networks we have or whatever options are available to us to really push forward adaptation and mitigation conversations, and in doing so, keep in mind that relational aspect and the desire and need for all of us to be thinking about a just and equitable transition. I'll wrap it there, but I encourage you all to stay tuned on the Future Earth website and on our Twitter page and other areas. We will be making all of the recordings available at a later date and synthesising across the full 3 days of the summit. Donations are open on our webpage. The whole event is free, but your donations assist us to provide support for honorariums for our guest speakers, as well as continue the work that we do here in the Future Earth Australia Secretariat. Thank you all so very much. I hope that you will all join us for our session, our full day rather, tomorrow, day 3, looking at transformations. With that, we'll say goodbye and see you tomorrow.